Hi guys, I'm Pete aka On a Retro Tip, and welcome to another episode in the series where I take a look at a system's unreleased games, and this time it's for Nintendo's insanely popular handhelds, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. The original Game Boy played a huge part in solidifying my love for gaming during my childhood, and it's hard to explain its influence to people who didn't experience it firsthand. Prior to the Game Boy's European release in 1990, we played on dedicated LCD handhelds like Nintendo's Game & Watch. This Donkey Kong one is the one I had as a kid and it was great, but how long can any one game hold your interest? The fact that the Game Boy had interchangeable cartridges was absolutely mind-blowing to 9-year-old me. The Game Boy will always be my favourite console of that era because, as I always say, it's not the hardware or number of on-screen colours that make a console great. Ultimately, it's the selection of great games, and the Game Boy and Game Boy Color had fantastic libraries. As good as those game libraries were though, there were a plethora of games that never saw release. Join me as I take a look at 20 of those cancelled games. Aeon-Metal Fighters is an unreleased side-scrolling shooter developed by June Team. I'm not sure at what point it was cancelled, but development began in 2001 and it seems that a significant amount of progress was made. The game has 6 worlds and 3 unique characters with corresponding ships, each with their own storyline. All the work on the graphical assets have been completed along with the game's music, which is fantastic, but the programming was reportedly only 70% complete when it was canned. It does look pretty impressive. Don't forget you're looking at a shooter running on the Game Boy Color here. It seems the cancellation was due to lack of interest from publishers, perhaps due to the release of the Game Boy Advance. But with the game being developed to this stage, let's hope that one day Aeon-Metal Fighters will be completed. Before it was released as Grunty's Revenge on the Game Boy Advance in 2003, it began its life as Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Curse on the Game Boy Color. Starting its development in 1999, Grunty's Curse was partly the same game, but with a different storyline and some additional levels which were eventually cut. The story sees Mecha Grunty place a curse on Banjo's friends, and takes place several years after the events of the first game, in contrast to the Game Boy Advance's time travelling plot which occurs a few months after it. There are sadly no videos available of the Game Boy Color version as it seemingly didn't get far beyond the planning stage, but I did find this video of one of the planned levels called Fiery Furnace, which you can see here in the Game Boy Advance beta, although it was cut from the final version of Grunty's Revenge. Titus Jr, also known as Baby Titus, was a planned platforming spin-off of Titus the Fox, the mascot of Titus Software. Being developed for Titus by Mika and Bob Baffy, the project was initially a Game Boy game, but in 1998 they decided to upgrade Titus Jr to the Game Boy Color. We can see from this video from Mika himself that they had at least somewhat progressed in doing so, but at some point during the process Titus ran into financial difficulties and the game was scrapped. Global Kumite was a versus fighter from Dutch developers Karma Studios. Sadly, I can only find these IGN screenshots of the game, but they were enough to pique my interest. It was planned to have 8 playable fighters initially, some being unarmed and others having various weapons, and extra characters could be unlocked along with additional game modes. It was unclear whether Global Kumite would have supported multiplayer via a link cable. The art style looks really nice, and is actually the kind of aesthetic that a lot of modern retro-inspired games are aiming for. It was slated for an early 2000 release, but sadly vanished. Trailblazers was a planned Game Boy port of the late 80s DOS game Death Track. Well, I say that, but I'm not actually sure whether the Game Boy port would have been called Death Track or Trailblazers. Being developed by Argonaut in 1991 to be published by Activision in 92, the Game Boy version had a third-person viewpoint, in contrast to the first-person perspective of the original. The wireframe graphics don't look too bad, but I'm struggling to see this little block as a car. What I do like though is the little shop between levels in which you can buy upgrades for your car and weapons. This idea and even the look of the shop are reminiscent of one of my all-time favourite racing games, Super Off-Road. All in all, it looks pretty impressive for a Game Boy game, but for some reason it was cancelled before release. Apologies because I'm about to butcher another Japanese pronunciation. HyouryuuShounen Keith, aka Castaway Boy Keith, was an RPG for the Game Boy being developed by Epic. Again, no gameplay footage of this one, only screenshots, but I found this game fascinating because it looks exactly like Link's Awakening, my favourite Game Boy game. Anyone who's played Link's Awakening will immediately see the resemblance here, and it may surprise you to learn that Castaway Boy Keith was developed 3 years prior to the Zelda game. The game's appearance isn't the only similarity, its plot saw Keith stranded on an island on which he has to explore dungeons in search of musical notes, which he needs to defeat the game's final boss. Ring any bells? I find this all very interesting and I only wish I knew more about this title. It was planned for a late 1990 release, but was for some reason cancelled. Elite, the classic BBC Micro and Acorn Electron game from 1984, also had a planned Game Boy port. To say the original Elite was groundbreaking is an understatement, and it was so far ahead of its time that its influence reached far into the future of video game development. I've covered Elite before in this series actually, as it had several console ports that were cancelled. This version, running on the Game Boy, was created in 1994 to pitch the idea of bringing Elite to Nintendo's handheld, but that obviously never happened. Green Beret, known as Russian Attack in North America, is a 1985 arcade action platformer from Konami. Numerous home computers and consoles received arcade conversions, including the NES, but nothing was known about a Game Boy Color version until 2009, when the dev's Naps team revealed that a port was in the works. It was reportedly being developed in late 2000, so that may give insight into the reason behind its cancellation, considering that the Game Boy's advance release was looming. Capcom's popular survival horror game Resident Evil was at one point coming to the Game Boy Color. It was planned for a 1999 release, but despite the game being almost complete and previewed, Capcom scrapped the project. 2 beta prototypes emerged in early 2012 when a fundraiser was organised over at Assembler Games to buy said prototypes from an anonymous owner. The fundraiser stated that if the campaign reached $2,000 within a certain time, the ROMs would be publicly released for all to enjoy. Some called this extortion, but come on, the guy was perfectly within his rights to sell them, and these crowd-funded fundraisers are a great way to get these prototypes out there. The two builds differ in content. As you can see from this one on screen, the layout of the original Resident Evil game has been preserved pretty faithfully, but there are no active enemies. Overall, I think it's very intriguing, and with a bit of polish it could have been a great Game Boy Color game, and I think it's one that Resident Evil fans would have loved to play. Katakis, or Katakis, I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly, was a side-scrolling shooter released by Rainbow Arts in 1987 for the Commodore 64. Katakis 3D was a planned sequel for the Game Boy Color, which was obviously a 3D game in contrast to the original's 2D, and is played from a third-person perspective from behind the ship, a la Afterburner. It was actually completed in 2001 after 5 months of development, but they couldn't find a publisher willing to take it on. Although I can only show you screenshots, it looks very nice graphically for a Game Boy Color game. It's unsure when or even if a ROM will be publicly released. Infinity was to be an RPG for the Game Boy Color and was in development from Affinix. Despite the company being dead since 2002, their website is still running and you can find some information about the game there. It seems that Infinity was the one and only game on which they are working and had an estimated completion date of late 2001, although no publishing date as a publisher had not been secured due to heavy interest in the Game Boy Advance. Affinix described Infinity as an epic 8 or 16-bit adventure in your pocket, and the game boasted a unique battle strategy system, quote, breathtaking graphics, complex maps, and over 100 usable items. All was quiet for a while until August 2016 when Affinix released a ROM of Infinity for free on their site. Although unfinished, it's playable, and it's largely the same as it was when development ended in 2001. The ROM ends about a quarter of the way through, but this was done intentionally to prevent players encountering any unfinished areas or experiencing save data corruption, and Affinix have estimated that the build is around 90% complete. It does have some nice graphics for the handheld as promised, and seems pretty decent if you're a fan of these types of RPG. I'll leave a link to their site in the description if you want to try it out. Stip was being developed for the Game Boy Color by Karma Studios. It's a cutesy platformer that has a graphical style reminiscent of the Super Nintendo or even Amiga platform games. It was to feature 36 levels across 4 worlds, a password save feature, rumble pack support, and a plethora of enemies including a screen-filling end boss. The story sees Stip's mates kidnapped by the evil Dr. Spiff, no, I said Spiff, and Stip sets off on a mission to rescue them. The game was at least 80% complete when it was cancelled, probably due to Karma Studios struggling to find a publisher. Whether or not this was due to the random name or lack of an established protagonist, I don't know. Wicked Surfing was in development from 1999 to 2000 by Cave Barn Studios to be published by Interplay. It's an isometric surfing game in which the player can perform various tricks to score points. An IGN preview gave some insight into the game's features. It would have 5 playable characters from which to choose and 2 game modes, a time attack in which the player must score as many points as possible within a given time, and a tournament mode. We can also see from the gameplay trailer here that there would be various wetsuits and surfboards to unlock, and also included a repair feature. Although Wicked Surfing looked promising graphically and was almost complete, Interplay were experiencing some financial issues and didn't pay the developers to finish it. According to Ludophiles, who gave me this clip, this gameplay trailer was distributed on a press kit CD in 1999. A Game Boy port of the original Diablo was considered by Blizzard North. A small team there knocked up a tech demo as a means to pitch the idea, but in the end they deemed the project's profitability to be too risky and scrapped the idea. A shame, as this looks pretty impressive, taking into account this was just at the tech demo stage. Diablo on the Game Boy was to include link cable functionality as a substitute for the handheld's lack of online capability. Who knows what could have been if Blizzard had thrown caution to the wind, as such a good looking game coupled with a popular IP like Diablo could have been quite the combination. The Mask Zero to Hero was developed by Pocket Studios for the Game Boy Color. Based on the Jim Carrey film The Mask, it was an action platformer starring the wacky character. I'm not sure if the plot was tied to the film or a brand new story. From these images we can see the titular Mask using a comically oversized mallet to whack enemies, but who knows what other weaponry or attacks would have been at the player's disposal. I only have screenshots of the game and no video sadly, but it looks intriguing if nothing else. The Mask was to be published by Dreamcatcher Interactive, but never made it to release. Yes, yet another mention of Tyrion on my channel, as a version of the PC vertical shooter Tyrian 2000 was developed for the Game Boy Color. This version doesn't look half bad. It's shorter than the PC original and the levels were redesigned. It was eventually cancelled when development moved over to the Game Boy Advance, but if you watch my video on cancelled Game Boy Advance games, you'll already know that that version was cancelled too. A ROM of the Game Boy Color version has subsequently been leaked online. Tyrannosaurus Tex was a first-person shooter being developed for the Game Boy Color by Slitherine Software, founded by an ex-Psygnosis employee. Any regular viewers of the channel may know that I'm not a fan of first-person shooters on handheld consoles, and to develop one for the relatively primitive Game Boy Color seems ambitious. The team produced a tech demo which was shown at the European Computer Trade Show in 1999. There were several interested parties, but it was Eidos who took it on, and development of the full game began in late 1999. The plot combined the Wild West with science fiction, featuring dinosaurs, robots, aliens and Texans. It was to have a whopping 28 levels, boasting 20 to 40 hours of gameplay, 6 guns, and if that wasn't ambitious enough, they even planned a multiplayer deathmatch via the link cable. Initially planned for an April 2000 release, Tyrannosaurus Tex was delayed until the end of the year, but before that time came, Eidos dropped support for the handheld altogether. As Slitherine continued to look for an alternative publisher, time dragged on into 2001 and the game ended up being completed. They never secured a publisher, so Tyrannosaurus Tex never made it to release until a limited run was produced by Pico Interactive, where it's available to buy now, so I'll leave a link in the description. Roadsters 98 was a top-down racing game akin to Micro Machines. There doesn't seem to be much information on the game or why it was cancelled, but it was being developed by Genetic Fantasia. Most likely it never made it past the prototype stage, but a ROM of a playable demo appeared online a while back. And straight into another top-down driving game here with Carmageddon Total Destruction Racing 2000. This was released for Windows, but a Game Boy Color port was planned from Taurus Games, albeit a rather different game. Employing a top-down view in the same vein as the handheld's port of the original Carmageddon, it was to feature 9 locations, each featuring 4 events, 2 missions and 2 races, and 20 different vehicles. A trailer was produced which slated an early 2001 release, and the game was shown at E3 in 2000, but for some unknown reason Carmageddon TDR 2000 was cancelled. Gekido was a planned Game Boy Color entry in the Gekido series of games, released for the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance by Nap's team. Absolutely nothing was known of the Game Boy Color version apart from some minor information on the Nap's team website and a few screenshots. That is until 2017, when Nap's team released the ROM on their Facebook page. This game looks really nice for a Game Boy Color game and has several playable characters. It plays like a handheld Double Dragon. The circumstances behind Gekido's cancellation are still unclear. So those were 20 of the many unreleased Nintendo Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Let me know which of them you think showed promise and which you consider better off on the scrap heap. And as always, thanks for watching. If you'd like to hear more about cancelled games, you can check out this playlist featuring cancelled games for various other systems.